Hello and welcome to our 2020 election Q&A, focusing on how the election and the events leading up to the election may change now that President Trump has tested positive for the coronavirus. My name is Samantha Pelham. I'm a media relations specialist here at Ohio University who works heavily with our faculty experts to share their expertise with the media and on platforms such as this. Today, I'll be asking Benjamin Bates, Professor of Health Communication in our Scripps College of Communication, and Dan Skinner, Political Scientist and Health Policy Professor in our Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine, a few questions regarding how the candidates, campaigns, and how the election may change due to this positive test. So welcome. Thank you, Ben and Daniel, for being here today. I appreciate it a lot to answer the questions that have been stirring around social media since we got this news this morning. So if you both could just please give us a little bit of background on your expertise and how it's related to this topic, that'd be really appreciated.
Well, as a professor of communication studies, I'm interested in issues of health and social impact. And one of the things that we look at is how do the messages that are sent by the president or other political leaders shape our understanding of health, and how do our perceptions of health shape our understanding of those political leaders? So I'm happy to be here to talk about how those issues might intersect today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Samantha, for having us. It's really great to do this. So I'm a political scientist by training, a political theorist in particular, but I am a health policy professor at the Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine. So for me, this is a perfect convergence of my different areas, the streams of my expertise. And in particular, this is where the question of policy and politics really collide. Even though some people try to keep them separate, you can't in this moment.
Great. Well, thank you both, and we really hope that this Q&A does offer some insight into questions that our viewers may have after hearing this news, and especially with the election coming up shortly, how it could be changing in these unprecedented times. So we'll go ahead and start with our questions that we've been seeing on social media and whatnot. So this is open to both of you to answer, so whoever feels necessary and wants to chime in at any point, please feel free to do so. Our first question is, what steps will take place if President Trump is too ill to govern?
Well, that seems like a classic political science question in a way. And, political scientists love to game out lots of different possibilities. There are some precedents for this, and the Constitution's been amended a few times. 9/11 changed the way we think about this as well, with the possibility of a so-called decapitation strike being very real, right? We all know that every year during the State of the Union address, at least one cabinet member is in an undisclosed location just in case something like that happens. So this is something that every administration and certainly the federal government, irrespective of the administration, should be thinking about. In this case, we know that President Trump has tested positive. We don't know what that means. Some people, as everybody I'm sure knows, with COVID can have mild symptoms and quarantine and then get back to work. But President Trump is 74 years old. He's got some health issues. We actually don't know too much about his health. That's one of the big questions right now. Most presidents have disclosed a bit more than he has. So, in that case, we can't really game out what's going to happen, and we're going to count on the White House to let us know at some point. They've been pretty quiet so far today. Vice President Pence has tested negative, or so far that's what we have. We know the testing is always a little bit of a moving target. So right now we're looking at a situation where if something like that happened, Vice President Pence would be well positioned to step in. Of course, if there's a viral thread that runs through the White House, that's when you start getting deeper down the bench and start talking about Nancy Pelosi, who's actually third in that order, who's a Democrat. Although Nancy Pelosi is 80 years old, below Nancy Pelosi is Chuck Grassley, who's 87. So we're, with COVID, we're talking about some serious potential for health interactions based on age and pre-existing conditions.
We have to be careful, though, when we're gaming out these situations, in that we know that COVID-19 affects different people differently, and as a novel virus, its impacts are almost impossible to predict. Even someone of Donald Trump's age, with as many risk factors as he potentially has, we're still talking about 85 to 90% survivability of the virus. The real key question here is what happens if the president is incapacitated by the virus, not merely becomes sick because of the virus. I mean, we've had presidents who have been sick before. We've even had presidents who have gone into surgery and have been unconscious and completely unavailable, and still we haven't invoked the 25th Amendment. That is the amendment about incapacity. What we would need is for the president to be utterly unable to discharge his duties and for him to either sign a piece of paper saying that he's temporarily relinquishing the power of the presidency, or for the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to say that the president is incapable of exercising his duties. We're talking about a highly unlikely scenario where the president would judge himself to be incapable. And in all honesty, we've never seen the vice president and cabinet invoke the 25th Amendment on a president. So it's a very minuscule likelihood of this happening.
I agree with Benjamin, by the way, which is it's important to not game this out. And again, like I said, I tried to emphasize that we don't know what the health situation is in the White House right now. I'm really hoping, and I think many are, that the White House will be forthcoming about that. They will give lots of updates. We haven't seen that yet, but that'll be one of the questions that moving ahead.
And I know I've seen on social media a lot of questions about, what if something were to happen that would put President Trump incapable of his duties or, succumb to this pandemic and COVID. What happens going forward since he is the Republican candidate for presidency? Would, Vice President Pence step up? Would there be, we're so close to the election, people are wondering what would happen if he's incapable to go through with the election.
We've already started the election, right? We've already started the election. People have already started voting. But what a lot of folks don't realize is that when they vote for president, they're not actually voting for the president. They're voting for a slate of electors, people who will be named by their state legislature as representing the will of the people in the Electoral College. And what would most likely happen is that since votes have already been cast, they would continue to be pledged towards Donald Trump and or his assigns, or should Vice President Biden become infected with the virus, the same on the Democratic side. And that those states' electors would probably go to Pence, although you could game out any one of a number of fantastical scenarios where they choose to commit the Republican states to some other person or some other candidate. But essentially, yes, Vice President Pence would step up into the position should Donald Trump die. That's the most likely thing to happen.
And I'll just add that, there have been candidates before that have died during campaigns, and that's exactly what happens. Usually, in different offices, you have special elections that are held and things like that. But I think, again, we're talking about very unlikely parts of this moment. But it's interesting to understand how the Constitution works. And also, I think for a lot of people, interesting to understand how little we know about what would happen under certain situations. I bet you have a bunch of people in the White House and in the House of Representatives combing through books trying to make sure that they understand just in case some unforeseen eventuality does occur.
Yeah, this truly does seem like a situation we could only, can't even explain to begin, that we're so close to an election and here we have this global pandemic happening, and then, on top of that, the president of the United States, who's also up for re-election, is now testing positive. It does seem quite like something we've never encountered in the history of this country before. So I know some other social media users have asked the question, does the Constitution say anything about an alternate election on a different timeline if, more and more people that are working within the election process and specifically the candidates, if they also test positive?
Benjamin?
Well, the short answer to that question is no. The Constitution doesn't say anything about an alternate election or a different timeline. The November date is set as the date by Congress. They have not changed that. That election will happen on time, on place. and that the various processes by when the Electoral College meets and when Inauguration Day happens are all clearly set out, and there's no provision for those to shift. The president or the Congress cannot simply say, we're going to suspend elections or delay elections. I don't foresee that happening.
Yeah, that would be truly unprecedented, and most likely be seen as a political move, almost under any condition that you could imagine.
Thank you. So you both spoke before about how, this is not the first time the president has gotten an illness while in office. So during even normal times, when a president does acquire a life-threatening illness, it's a big thing. But this, like we've said, is unique and very unprecedented, and taking place just weeks before the presidential election, during the pandemic, and as the Supreme Court nomination process is also underway. So how should we think about this convergence of these different factors?
Well, the first thing I think is to acknowledge how head-spinning it all is. It's quite a historical moment. We are living in history right now. I don't think any of us need to be told that. But at this case, presidential illness is a big deal symbolically, politically. When presidents get tests, people take note. When they go do preventative and wellness checks, even, I mean, that's a big deal. We've seen this through the HIV issue crisis as well, like when presidents step up and talk about things or don't. And when people hide things, that's really important. Most people woke up this morning and saw this as de facto a national security crisis in some way, right? Now, not to say that I don't want to overuse the word crisis, but certainly aside from the politics of it all, foreign governments are watching this very carefully. We are already concerned about interference in the election from various countries. So our intelligence folks in DC and elsewhere are probably working way overtime right now. We've had situations where President Wilson famously, after the 1919 influenza epidemic, was incapacitated, and it's widely believed that his wife essentially ran the country for some time. The historian John Barry has talked about that, and others. President Eisenhower had a stroke very famously in Colorado, and that produced conversation about Richard Nixon, who was vice president, in his role. When presidents go under general anesthesia, there are provisions for the temporary turning over of the keys, so to speak, to a vice president. But it's always, doing two things at once. It's we're concerned because it's the leader of this country, but also it has ramifications for what other countries might be looking at and thinking about, and that we have to watch.
That said, I think we do need to acknowledge that the acting presidency is very rare and has very rarely been done. It's important for us to know that the 25th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1965, ratified in 1967, and there have been a total 12 hours that we've had acting presidents since then. 8 hours when George Herbert Walker Bush was undergoing a surgery, and we briefly had his vice president step in, and 2 times when Dick Cheney spent 2 hours as acting president when George W. Bush was undergoing colonoscopies. So it's extremely rare for a president, no matter how sick they are, no matter how poorly they might be feeling, to turn over to an acting presidency. I mean, that's why it makes such great drama on television or movies. Why Harrison Ford in Air Force One, they considered invoking the 25th Amendment because he was a hostage on an airplane. I mean, we have to think of these ridiculous scenarios where there is discussion of imposing the 25th Amendment. It's just super rare.
John Goodman became president for a bit there in the West Wing as well. A perfect TV drama. Yeah.
It makes much better television drama than it does an actual news story when you look to when the 25th Amendment gets invoked.
Right, and I think that's why it's important to, on a serious note, to just take stock of the moment. I mean, the Supreme Court nomination of Amy Coney Barrett is first of all, there was questions about whether she had been exposed as well. This is being pushed very strongly through the Senate, as we all know. So there's a political push here to do this, and we worry about political pushes, at times where the stakes are life and death for, with a virus that's extremely lethal. So, and also just the speed with which this is all happening. And then, of course, we're 1 month out from a presidential election that is one of the most hotly contested in our nation's history. So we are trying to do careful public health thinking. And at a time when there's so many incentives to throw careful public health thinking out the door. And I think President Trump is going to have to explain at a certain point about how these pieces fit together based on how he was approaching the question of masks and social distancing, as opposed to Joe Biden.
Yeah, and I mean, what you said about how quickly and how fast this has been. I mean, the debate was on Monday, and today is Friday. And I woke up this morning, that was my first headline that I read, and to think that just days ago, not they're still practicing, distancing, and there wasn't a huge gathering for the debate, but there were still people in the same room together, and how much that's changed in just 4 short days, really.
Well, there's been quite a bit of media coverage as well. I mean, the site where the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western, where they held the debate, there was a scene where the members of President Trump's entourage refused masks. And that's being looked at pretty carefully by folks who are trying to do, first of all, just the contact tracing to figure out who might have been exposed. But also in terms of presidential leadership and the broader narrative of putting public health first.
Yeah, one of the first things that Donald Trump said during the debate was making fun of the large mask that Joe Biden was wearing, as if to denigrate all these public health measures that we know are important to preventing the spread of COVID-19. And then for him to stand not all that far away from Joe Biden, breathing on him without telling Joe that he had been exposed to the virus, again violates public health measures. And now that the president has been diagnosed with it, it makes us say, did he take this seriously? Does he understand the importance of these public health measures? If even the most tested, most protected person in the United States can get this, then this must be a virus that spreads very easily, that anyone can get. We're all at risk. And it's going to require a change in the public messaging that we hear. Otherwise, it's going to look like the president doesn't understand the illness that he himself now has.
And following up with that, do you think that, in your professional, expert opinion, that his messaging after experiencing this going forward will be different, since, this is the first time he's tested positive for it, and we're still, kind of trying to reel with that, and like you said on Monday, him talking about the mask, do you think going forward it will kind of change his perspective on things?
If there's anything we know about President Trump, it's that he's not chastened very easily about anything, and changing his messaging. I mean, I think that's going to be one of the fascinating things to watch. If he has a very mild experience with COVID-19, and he's back at doing all the visual things that we see in politics, he may try to use that to some degree. I don't want to game it out necessarily, but I think his track record shows that would be his preference in that situation. Of course, there is a question about whether there can be any more debates. There probably will be no more large "Make America Great Again" rallies. I mean, it would be really something if they were able to get back to that in the last 2 weeks of this election. Everything has got to change. I think he really risks at this point really looking quite silly if he doesn't take this seriously and do that. But that's just not his brand either. So that's a real tricky thing. Benjamin's the communications expert, though.
Dan is, I think, 100% correct here in that for Trump to maintain his rhetorical style, to be able to continue to position himself on this issue, he really can't change how seriously he takes COVID-19. And we already saw an announcement that came out of the White House today that said that President Trump has a very mild case. He has a very strong body. He is in generally excellent health, sort of saying that Donald Trump is sufficiently strong and sufficiently manly that he'll be able to overcome this virus, unlike people who have pre-existing conditions, who are weak in some way, as in the rhetoric that Trump has used in the past. If he has a mild case, he'll be able to continue to say, this is a super mild disease, just like young people, it barely touches them. You'll hear this kind of stuff come out of the Trump White House, unless he gets a super serious development later on. But right now, he seems to be maintaining the COVID-19's nothing big for a lot of us to worry about. I actually would anticipate that as soon as he's able to get back on the campaign trail, he's going to have a big rally, and there won't be masks in attendance, and they'll be all huddled together, not having their 6-foot distance, because that's what he's been doing for the past 6 months to downplay the seriousness of the virus. And I don't anticipate a change in that.
But clearly, the messaging coming out of the White House is not sufficient to really understand what's going on. He quite conspicuously has been not tweeting today so far at the point we're talking, and that's highly unusual for him. He is slightly obese, at least in clinical terms. He is on statins for high cholesterol. He does have slightly elevated blood pressure. I mean, lots of people do. I don't want to make too much of it, but to sort of brand him as a superhero, hypermasculine type who's going to beat this disease is, it's really reckless when you're talking about somebody who has the kind of responsibilities he has.
It is tremendously reckless, but that's why some people have said that Donald Trump is our first reality show president, not our first reality-based president. It's often about the image that he wants to project, and as long as he can maintain that, I think he and his team will try to do that.
Yeah, I can foresee that. So going off of the debates going forward, we are supposed to have a debate next week. What do you think will happen with that? I know a lot of people have asked the question, are we still tuning in, or are we going to have to wait to see what's going to happen, especially since, we know that that Biden has tested negative as of this morning from what we've heard as well. So yeah, what's going to happen with the upcoming debates?
Your guess is as good as mine on what's going to happen with those debates. Remember, just 12 hours ago, we were talking about whether they were going to renegotiate the conditions of the debate to have a mute button that the moderator could use. And there was talk about either Biden or Trump withdrawing from that debate. And now we have this, that once you have been exposed, you're supposed to wait those 14 days before you go out and be among other people. That puts the viability of this debate happening into question. And so I wouldn't know if there's going to be a debate or not for both pre-existing conditions and our current condition, and who knows what'll happen tomorrow.
All of us at Ohio University, or many of us, were all on Zoom meetings and doing all this kind of like we're doing today. And there is a question, why can't they do that? But then again, imagine the debate from the other night, but with all the interrupting that happens with time delays on this. I mean, it would be essentially unwatchable in my view. So I think it's I would guess that they've got to rethink them at a minimum. They're not going to be standing next to each other. There's no way I can conceive Joe Biden doing that and still being able to claim that he's taking this more seriously than the president. So certainly this changes things, but I'm with Benjamin on this. I don't think that we can game any of this out because this politics is highly unpredictable.
So then a president acquiring a viral infection such as COVID has consequences beyond just the health of the president. Can you talk about some of the other consequences that this brings in?
Yeah, I have been interested as a political scientist in the kind of symbolic value of presidential illness and health. I mean, even things like, President Clinton and his jogging, and I mean, lots of presidents have made their fitness routines, a big deal. And we've seen that. We saw that with Trump's attacks on Clinton in the last election when she fainted. We've seen that with some of the Project Lincoln ads and questions of Donald Trump's fitness, and certainly that's something that Donald Trump has done to Joe Biden. So this has already been on the map, and of course, Ronald Reagan and the assassination attempt. I mean, the history history is as old as the presidency itself with doing this. But certainly the leadership aspect is very important to me. We have I teach in a medical school. We work hard to get the students to understand their responsibilities, not just when they're working with patients, but as leaders in the community. And putting a mask on, for better or worse, has become a political statement. And navigating that as part of the leadership skills that any one politician is going to decide that they want to display. Clearly, Joe Biden decided, I'm going to go all in on this. And President Trump did not. And here we are. So what this means that it didn't pan out for President Trump, because if he had made it through this without any problems, that would mean something different, or he at least would try to use that to mean something different. So I think people watch presidents pretty carefully, and we can't underestimate the importance of that.
Yeah, I think Dan's correct here that, I mean, our president, as Mary Stuckey writes, is our interpreter in chief, that the president receives so much more information than the rest of us, has so many more advisors than the rest of us, that when there's a complex issue that's presented, the president can set the tone for how the nation is to respond. And if this president had chosen to wear a mask, had chosen not to have mass gatherings, had chosen to follow all of the public health recommendations, we would probably be in a very different place than we are right now. And now when we see the president contracting COVID-19, it's teaching us a lesson as a people as well, that if he can get it, any of us can get it. And his response to his illness is also going to shape how other people who test positive for COVID-19 are likely to act. So it's definitely a leadership question. The president is that sort of role model who is supposed to embody what the United States does. And depending on what he does, I think we'll see some very real practical impacts from everyday people.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I don't personally have any more questions, and I think all of the questions that have been floating around social media and in people's minds about this, you both have answered great and really given us some insight into how this can impact the election and going forward as well. So I just want to offer the floor if either one of you have any additional comments about what's currently going on or public health in general.
I'll say, again, and we've already touched on this briefly, but it's important to be careful because we are operating with a deficit of knowledge. And I think it's the White House's responsibility to fill that gap. There should be regular, when the president has a deadly disease, there should be regular media appearance. There should be opportunities to ask questions. There should be physicians talking directly to the people. And, that's going to be something that the White House is going to have to decide. I suspect that if they don't do that, not that the president already has a good relationship with the media or anything like that, but there is a possibility that if he plays this right, he could demonstrate, like, I can get through this, and there are leadership opportunities even with 1 month left for the election. But if he doesn't do that, he's going to raise a lot of suspicion, and suspicion is really deadly in a presidential campaign.
I think the other topic that we might want to navigate is that the White House under President Trump has been a well of misinformation and disinformation on many topics, and that there's a lot of distrust that people have in messaging that's coming out of the White House in terms of its consistency and its reliability. And so I think it is advisable to inform the public on the president's prognosis and whatnot, but it's also important to know that a lot of people are taking that with a grain of salt because Donald Trump has exaggerated his healthiness in the past, and there are people who are likely to believe that he is doing so in the present. And so trying to restore that trust of the American public is a huge challenge that he would have in presenting how well he's doing with COVID-19.
Great. Well, thank you both for sitting down and talking to me and answering these questions. Like I said, I really appreciate it, and I think our viewers are also going to really appreciate kind of hearing, answers that may be on their mind, especially since, like we've discussed, this is truly an unprecedented and crazy time in our history. So again, thank you both for being here. I appreciate it. And, I hope you guys stay safe and that everything goes well for you. And for those watching, please wear a mask, stay safe as well, and vote, please. All of those. Thank you.